Good morning, everybody. Very glad to see you all back, and I hope you're fully re-energized for the second day of our annual STM US conference. I think we can look back at a really good day yesterday, most of all because you were such a lively and interactive audience. The title of this year's conference is about disruptions and eruptions. And just to take you through the landscapes where we were yesterday, we started with the here and now, with the STM industry report full of descriptions and details and data about the way our industry is doing. Then Michael Clark took us into a panel with all kind of new initiatives that are more outside the norm. So he was taking us across the boundaries into a new landscape. After that, we entered data land, and we had a really good session with, of course, with Christine Borgman, who is really one of the top names in this area, and also projects that publishers are involved in. The afternoon was extremely lively when we discussed sharing networks, the scientific networks, and it was really good to have one of those networks here, academia.edu, because I can tell you that for years we were already trying to get them to our conferences and to have them as speakers, and that was always very difficult. So in that way, we had a little bit of a scoop. And then, of course, we had the early career panel and discussed the challenges for young researchers to get published and also to do things right and not to get lost in the publishing landscape. So that was sort of the tour along the horizon where we went yesterday. Today we're also going to enter new lands, discover new areas. Our first session will be about metrics, and we have one of the rising stars in that area here, but you'll get her introduced a little later. There are many new metrics around, and it's important to find out where the hot air is or where the substance is and what can be used for what. Then we will also be launching today the technology trends. You've already seen a little bit of them on the notepads in your conference pack, but you'll get all those complicated wheels, you'll get them all explained later today after the break. Then we have another panel about metrics, and we conclude the conference with the very popular flash sessions, as always. So I hope you're ready for it, and I think we're about to get that going. I would like to introduce the moderator, because you know I'm not the moderator myself, I'm just the moderator of the moderators. So our moderator of the first session is Sam Bruinsma. He is our new chair of the Future Lab Committee, STM's Future Lab Committee. You'll see some work of that committee in the technology trends. Sam Bruinsma is the vice president of business development and is involved in acquisitions, business models, online product development for Brill, one of the oldest publishers in the Netherlands. And, take it away, Sam, I would say.
Good morning. Good morning. This week, virtual all presentations during this meeting have touched upon metrics one way or the other, clearly showing that it has grown into a standard dimension when discussing major topics in scholarly communications. We have also seen that the perception and appreciation of these metrics vary. So I'm very happy to introduce our keynote speaker today, this morning, who is an expert on the value and the impact of new metrics, especially in connection to social media. Cassidy Sugimoto is assistant professor at the School of Information and Computing at Indiana University. The few of us who have attended the Innovation Seminar last December in London already had the privilege to hear Cassidy speaking on this subject. I myself also remember the breathtaking pace and energy of her presentation. So if you are not fully awake yet, I promise you will be. Here is Cassidy Sugimoto.
Thank you and good morning. I'll be talking about requisite variety and scholarly metrics today, focusing on novel forms of impact and looking at their validity. Now, there are a lot of words in this title and subtitle and sub-subtitle, but there's one word missing that if you know something about my scholarship or this area, you may be expecting to see. And that word is Altmetrics. Now, I'd like to begin with a plea that we stop using the word Altmetrics. Because in many ways, I think the Altmetrics movement has failed. That is, it has failed to do what it promised to do. Now, I'm not the first to critique Altmetrics. In 2010, there was a damning Nature editorial that wrote 2 years on since the publication of the Altmetrics Manifesto, which was published by Jason Priam and then doctoral student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, little has changed in academia. It goes on to say that social media has not been taken up as an integral part of the academic movement, and there's a lot of skepticism concerning its real value, and that the evaluation methods have not sufficiently been validated to be ready for adoption. Now, many of you will say, well, this was 5 years ago, and social media has certainly seen greater uptake. In 2012, Wouters and Costas did an extensive review of social media metrics, going through all of the tools, some of which you heard from yesterday, academia.edu, ResearchGate, and others. And they concluded that Altmetrics needs a far stricter protocol of data quality and indicator reliability and validity before they can be appropriately used for assessment. And as recently as yesterday, if any of you read Nature, the Leiden Manifesto has included Altmetrics in the other kinds of metrics that they assessed, and I think they summed it up nicely when they said metrics have proliferated, and they're usually well-intentioned, not always well-informed, and often ill-applied. Now, I think that this issue goes beyond validity and reliability, and that's certainly an issue that we'll return to later, but I think the Altmetrics movement failed on a deeper level. It failed on its promise. So let me give you a little bit of contextualization on this. Jason Priam, who is the coiner of the term Altmetrics, wrote a chapter in our book Beyond Bibliometrics last year, in which he said 3 things about Altmetrics which I think are critical for understanding this movement and what it purported to do. The first thing he said was that Altmetrics were an approach to uncovering previously invisible traces of scholarly impact. That is, to make visible what was invisible, to bring to light all of these things that scholars do, all of the ways in which scholarship is communicated, and to reward that. Secondly, he argued that citations miss many important kinds of impact. Now, this is a critical one because it sets citations in opposition to altmetrics, right? Altmetrics can replace citations. Altmetrics do something that citations could not do. And third, he calls citations products of a slow, rigid, formal communication system and says that's not how scholarship works. Scholarship is messy, it's fast-paced, it's dynamic, and citations and the publication systems from which they are derived do not adequately capture what's happening. In that way, he starts to move against the publication system as it exists today, saying that this publication system and its citations are not functioning adequately to capture scholarship. So we have 3 things going on here: that altmetrics don't like the current publication system, altmetrics are in opposition to citations, and altmetrics will show us something that we've never seen before. So simply put, altmetrics was seen to be this great democratization of scholarship and scholarly impact measurements. And it's premised on the idea that scholars do a lot of things, right? They go to conferences like this one, they publish, they analyze data, they discuss data. Occasionally, scholars have personal lives, and sometimes they interact with the public. And that altmetrics would make manifest all of these things, would be able to measure the output of all of these things. And this was in contrast to citations, which only focused on one part of this, right? It looks at the publishing thing, and it measures the impact that publishing has on other people who publish. And that was seen as insufficient for the altmetrics movement. Now, the reality is that altmetrics have been around for 5 years, and they've focused almost exclusively on that same node, that of publishing. They have looked only at things that have published and look at tweets to those scholarly publications, Facebook likes to those scholarly publications, Mendeley saves of those scholarly publications. Now, this is an important thing, right? Looking at different measures of the impact of those publications. But it's failed to really capture all of the things that were invisible. Publications haven't been invisible, right? Altmetrics, therefore, hasn't made something visible that wasn't before. And most of the analyses of altmetrics haven't been looking at opposition, but looking how they relate to citations as the gold standard. So you'll see many studies like this one, which is one that we did of millions of PubMed documents, to look at correlations between citations and Twitter counts. Now, our findings were that they were significant, right? But as many psychology journals are banning p-values, I'd also say we'd have to ban the p-value here, because the correlation coefficient is 0.183. Right? So it's significant because we have a lot of documents, but there's a lot that's not understood there, right? There's a lot that's not explained in that measurement. So I'd like to say that we replace the term altmetrics, that we get rid of altmetrics in favor of the notion of requisite variety. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with cybernetics, the law of requisite variety states that if a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanism must be greater than or equal to the number of states in the system being controlled. Simply put, every system that controls must be as variegated, as diverse as the system itself, right? Our control mechanisms must take into account the diversity of the input in that system. Now, everyone in this room is sitting in a place to create those control mechanisms through the publication system. And we have to ask ourselves, are the mechanisms underlying this capturing the diversity of input that's available? So if we think through this, we have lots of kinds of input. The people, right at the center, the people who are producing it are one kind of input, and all of these publications themselves have diversity, right? There's diversity in scholarship and scholars, and there's also diversity within each of these nodes. We can think about publishing as not being monolithic, right? Publishing, we can think about theses, conference papers, journal articles. Each of these have their own diversities, and as you heard from Chris Borgman yesterday, data itself has diversity. So what is the role of the publisher then in this diversity? And I want to keep thinking about that throughout this talk. How can a publisher address requisite variety in the system? So I'm going to go through 3 different areas and think about the diversity in that and think about what the role of the publisher might be in this. So let's start with producers. Now, as Foucault famously asked, what does it matter who is speaking? Well, it matters a lot. Notions of credibility and authority are tied up with who's speaking. So this is a figure from the National Science Indicators assessment from 2014, I believe. It has 2012 data. And it shows the U.S. confidence in various types of people. So you see the military has the greatest confidence for the U.S., and the scientific community falls second. You can go down and find religious and different education, organized religion, and it's perhaps not surprising that Congress is at the very bottom of this list, right? So it matters who's speaking. But scientists aren't the only ones speaking anymore. As Harry Collins asked, are we all scientific experts now? So I've done a few studies of the TED Talks, which are a huge science communication effort. And what we found was only 25%. Only 1/4 of TED Talk presenters had what we would call academic credentials, right? So the people who are disseminating science, technology, medical advice to the masses are largely not credentialed in the way that we think. So one of the things we have to do is when we're looking at products of scholarships, we have to say, who is creating that scholarship? How can we capture that? How can we capture the data of their pedigree, of their credibility, of the reliability of this producer when we are looking at the outputs? We can also look at this in terms of micro-attribution. So here's an old Unisys model that was revised with the internet, and it shows the producer at the top, right? The producer produces something, and it goes through all of these different layers of mediation. It goes through publishers, through abstracting and indexing services. It goes through a layer of the web, right, as one big layer, until it reaches the consumer, right? It reaches the user. And there's a huge distance between the producer and the user. Well, I'd argue that that's no longer the case, largely due to social media, right? We're living in an interactive space where the producers and the consumers are constantly and iteratively interacting. So someone may post a blog post and has a table or a figure from some of the research they're doing, and someone will react to that, respond to that. We have many famous stories of bloggers finding mistakes in scientific output before it's published. So that is integrated into the research process. They push something on archive as a preprint. Someone reacts to it, responds to it, and they make changes before the final publication comes out. So we have to ask, who are those participants now? Are they authors? Are they reviewers? What is their role in scientific publishing when they are engaging with the content at such an early stage? So we need to reconceptualize attribution and myco-attribution, and this is heightened by hyper-authorship. So it's not uncommon now to have a publication with 500 authors, and that publication may be 7 pages long, right? I would argue that each author didn't write something, right? We've thought differently about what it means to be an author in this era. Now, what it means to be an author also questions who can be an author and what they do. So one of the studies that we did looked at the last 5 years of publications in Web of Science and looked at the male to female ratio in that. Now, the bluer the country here, the more male-dominated its publication output, and the pinker, the more female-dominated. So as you can see, it's a blue world, and there's an inset there for the United States, which is also blue, right? Any study you do, whether you're looking at publications, whether you're looking at numbers of researchers, women rarely make it above 40% of the producers in this thing, 40% of the production attributed to them. Ours found about 30% of this. So this changes who can be involved as a producer. And furthermore, even if we know this, they don't all produce in the same way. So we have some research where we've been looking at what we're calling the Cinderella effect. And now what we did is we took contributorship data from PLOS. So PLOS is a journal that at its input, at its control mechanism, it asked people to say not only who is an author, but what did they do? How did they contribute to this paper? Did they analyze the data? Did they design the project? Did they contribute reagents or other materials? Did they do the experiment? Or did they write the paper? And we took this from millions of documents, and we looked at all of these authorship-contributorship pairs according to gender. And what we find is that women, the odds of someone who's doing the experiment being a woman is 1.52 that of a man. That is, women are doing the experiments. Women are the hands of the science. Now, men are more likely to be in every other role, and particularly contributing reagents, which means that male authorship is bought by the materials that are surprised. Female authorship is bought by conducting the experimentation, showing huge differences in how these people are contributing to scientific work. Now, this analysis is only possible because that mechanism exists to capture the data, to capture it at the point of publication. Now, we may say, well, at least the internet is a great democratizer, right? This allows everyone to be equal, and we can generate so much data from these online platforms. You heard about academia.edu, ResearchGate yesterday. Well, we did another study where we looked at Google Scholar, Mendeley, and Microsoft Academic Search. And what we found is that the typical scholar on this platform was male, 80% of them. 57% were over 35. They were white. They had head and shoulders, indoors, and they wore casual black clothing. So essentially, they're all Steve Jobs, right? So this platform itself replicates what we see in the academic environment. Furthermore, we took tens of thousands of images. We randomly selected from these things, and we sent it out for a survey. And we asked people to describe them, right? What are they wearing? What color? Are they wearing glasses or not? And then we asked them 2 subjective questions. How professional is this person? And how attractive is this person? And you probably wouldn't be surprised that women are seen as significantly more attractive and significantly less professional. So are younger people. And there was very little difference for race. So one of these things shows us that when you're on that platform, controlling for all variables, controlling for clothes, glasses, the type and the quality of the shot, women are seen as significantly less professional still, which has huge implications for the production of science. So what do we know? We know that producers are diverse, and they vary significantly by platform. Data generated by a platform will show you only a single slice of the academic output. And we know that producers vary in how they contribute and how much they contribute. So what can we do? Well, we can create mechanisms to capture this diversity at input. As publishers, you have the opportunity to capture demographic information, to capture contributorship information. And as we make visible that which was invisible through this requisite variety, we can start to work towards policies, procedures, and practices that equalize scientific output. So let's look at that output. Let's look at what's being produced. So many of you in the US may be familiar with the makerspace movement, which has been big both here and in Australia. And this started in libraries, where libraries said, we shouldn't just be places where people come and consume knowledge. Let's be places where people create knowledge. So some of the first things were just putting in a place for people to print their own books, You want to write that novel? Great, come write it here and print it. And then it started to be engineering centers, having students and children working on robotics within the library. And now this notion of creatorship, of makers, has taken over in academia as well, right? We want to be makers. We don't want to just type things and be writers, but we also want to be makers. And we're starting to reward new kinds of media, new kinds of ways of disseminating and creating scholarship. Now, this diversity, as for standardization, how are we going to measure that? Is that a valid form of scientific output? How do we record that and incentivize that? We also see that people are using these different media in scholarship. So my colleague Mike Thelwall at the University of Wolverhampton did a study where he looked at what people were citing. And this was in 2011, I think is the latest data here. But he saw a huge and exponential rise in people citing images, videos, social networking sites, all of these other media. People were using this to inform their research. And as they do that, we need better ways of capturing that, understanding that, curating that, and preserving that. Now, of course, there's always the concern that as these new things come, it will destroy everything else. We will lose everything else. So some of the studies we've done have looked at this. Let's look at two things which are close, are similar, but not identical. So we've looked at preprints compared to journal articles. Has one replaced the other? And we looked at one strong preprint community, astronomy and physics, which has had a huge history of sharing preprints both off and online. So we looked online at arXiv. And now what you see here shows Web of Science papers, and these are the different subject categories, and the percentage of those Web of Science papers that were also found on arXiv. Now, for the biggest category, astronomy and astrophysics, more than 70% of those were also found on arXiv. So people say, who needs the journal of record, right? arXiv is covering all of this. But if you go down to all of these other categories, less than 10% are on arXiv. To get rid of the journal of record would get rid of 90% of that scholarship, right? Preprints have not replaced the journal of record. Preprints have rather allowed a faster dissemination model for that content. So in looking at that dissemination model, we looked at citations, both to the preprint and to the cited journal of record. And what we found is there's a huge spike within a year, right? People citing that preprint because it's available, because it's accessible. But as soon as the journal of record comes out, it flatlines, and people start to cite the journal of record. Now, you can read this in multiple ways. In one way, you say people they like the journal of record. The other argument could be the journal of record has standards. They know how to cite it. It makes sense. It has permanence, right? And as soon as a preprint service were to do that, it might put that journal of record out of business. So these are the things that we have to weigh. Is there something fundamental about that journal of record that's keeping people there, or is it merely the standards? Now, in addition to producing texts and scholarship, there's another kind of thing that we produce, and that is other scholars, right? Self-propagation of scholars through doctoral mentoring. So one area that's of particular interest to me is academic genealogy, right? The networks of scholars as they are mentored. And in looking at this, we can say one person who mentored another person, what is that impact? Right? And the argument is that I could write a finite amount of publications in my life, but if I mentor 5 more people, who go on to each mentor 5 more people and 5 more people, what an incredible impact I can have on the field. Now, this is one of those types of impact that's invisible, right? There are people who mentor dozens of students, and they have no incentives for that, no reward structure for that, no measurement of that. It has been held invisible, and we need to make this visible. We need to incentivize this. Most of my work has been done using ProQuest Dissertations and Theses database, which is a phenomenal database, except it doesn't give me these relationships. So this to make just a database of 3,000 took me about 3 years of manual data collection, going through microfiche and finding the mentorship relationships among these. It shouldn't be that hard, right? At the point of input, we have control mechanisms where we can ask for this data, and ProQuest now does this, but has not done this historically, right? So as people in this field, you have the opportunity to capture data which can make visible previously invisible types of information. Now, you may say, well, academic genealogy, that is just the grossest kind of navel-gazing possible. And it's true, it is navel-gazing, but it can allow for different kinds of things to be seen. So the first women's studies dissertation had no one from women's studies on it, right? It had historians and anthropologists and sociologists fields coming together to create a new field. And if we look at humans and people as harbingers of those disciplinary identities, we can see the birth, the death, the creation, the merger of new kinds of disciplines. Again, only made possible when we capture data in that way, when we know where people receive their PhDs, when we can watch that interaction occur. So my dream of all of this is to capture that heterogeneity and connect it back to those producers who are themselves diverse. If we could look at their demographics, if we could know all of the kinds of productions that they're engaged in and the metrics associated with them, that gives us greater data to be able to make assessments, to be able to improve the scientific workforce and scholarship itself. So what do we know? We know that there's a proliferation of new kinds of scholarship being produced. And we know that the new forms aren't replacing the old. But what we need, again, are greater mechanisms for identifying, capturing this diversity, and linking all of that production with the producers. So the third thing I'll look at is how it's being reviewed, right? If we're producing this diversity from diverse stakeholders, how are we reviewing it? Well, there have been many, many, many forms of open peer review that have been tried, and I think as the gentleman from academia.edu said, those are the graveyards of new companies, right? They have largely failed, and they failed for a variety of reasons, largely being a lack of incentive structure. However, it is not true that academics are unwilling to comment online. They are an active online community. What we need to do is figure out how to incentivize and capture that. So this is a humorous example from a hashtag on Twitter called 6-word peer review, where people go through and try to review an article using only what they can in their 140 characters on Twitter, right? So your bibliography is a giant selfie, right? I don't get paid for this, which shows that underlying incentive structure. And my favorite, Wellman actually tweeted, "How could you not cite Wellman?" Right? Which leads to sort of the egoism that happens within peer review. But this shows that academics are willing to be online. They're willing to have these discussions. We just need to figure out how to incentivize and capture it. Now, we also need to think about the rise of Amazon's Turk and other kinds of distributed labor and microtask systems. As scholarship is produced by 500 people, we might ask, why is it not reviewed by 500 people? If it takes 500 people with different skills, expertise, does it not also take 500 people to review that expertise and ensure that it's accurate? Now, this is hard, right? How would you take one document and get 500 people to comment on it? But this may be, again, another place where the role of publishers who can manage these kinds of distributed labor systems, manage what's happening in this publication output in a way that's simplified and streamlined. So what we know, open peer review projects have failed. They've failed largely because of a lack of incentive structures. And scholarship is becoming more interdisciplinary and requires greater variety. Again, we have that requisite variety problem. Peer review doesn't match the requisite variety of the input of scholars and scholarship. So we need to create mechanisms for incentivizing. But we also need to think about microreviewing, think about other ways, other systems that can be put in place to review things better. So let's get to the heart of this, right? These novel forms of impact and how they work and how they might fit into this system of requisite variety. So we can measure on lots of different units of analysis, lots of different levels. Now, some of these novel metrics are applied to the unit of the article, and many systems, such as Nature, PLOS, and others, have incorporated these altmetrics and the social media metrics into the article, right? For an article, you can see its impact, and they largely draw from companies like altmetric.com, which provide these data from publicly available sources, right? So you can see for this one article, it was tweeted 497 times, it was on Facebook pages, and these are public Facebook pages and public Twitter accounts, I should note. It was picked up by these news outlets, blogged, it was on F1000. And then they pull it together into this weighted score saying, this article, this one unit is worth 992, right? And now we can rank them and we can sort them and we can look at them, but that tells you the value of that article. We can also do this for an individual, for a person. Now, Jason Priam, who I mentioned earlier, and Heather Pavovar started a company called Impact Story, where, for a price, they will curate your online portfolio for you. They will tell you who's reading your work, what's your most read work, what's your most tweeted work, how is your work having an impact on the world. Now, there are also metrics at the institutional level. So one of my favorite videos is actually the Mendeley's Institutional Edition video, where a gentleman with a nice voice will tell you that the scholars have left the library. You've become obsolete. But Mendeley can help you. It can give you data to bring the scholar back into the library. And how do they do that? Well, they'll find everyone who affiliates with your institution, and they'll give you all of their data so you can see what they're reading, what they're saving, how they're commenting on things. And this can allow you, the librarian, a better chance of collecting. Now, this isn't fundamentally different from usage data provided by Counter and others, right, telling you what your users are doing. But it's going out to these social sites, these voluntary social sites, and then pulling that data back in for you to use as an institution. Now, there's a lot of opportunities in here as well, right? What data can we capture and give back to an institution to make better decisions? This is, again, one of those opportunities of social media metrics. The last one is the hardest one. Right, so the research evaluation framework in the UK, along with many other evaluation frameworks, have said, show us your social impact. Tell us what you're doing that's making the world a better place. And scholars are scrambling to try to use these. And the one thing, the low-hanging fruit, are altmetrics. They say, great, if I was tweeted, I've had social impact. Right? The public read my work and responded to it. The public likes my work. Right? Well, that's based on a very faulty assumption, which we'll talk about in a second. Right? That requires that these metrics are valid and that they measure what they purport to measure, that is, in this case, social impact. So let's look at a few of these. Here's a study that we did of PubMed articles. And these PubMed articles, we looked and we saw those, and I showed you the correlations, right? They're correlated at 0.183. But we also looked at the 10 things that were the most tweeted. And if you look at these, they are also not the most cited. Some of them have no citations at all, and many have few citations. Now, these were from 2011, and the first two, I don't know if you can read the text, but the first two deal with Fukushima. So that was a trending topic, right? That was an important topic. And we can think about its topicality as driving its tweets. The next one is Google, and now an internet-savvy audience is probably going to care about new research on Google. But if you go down to the Kramer 2011, you see something that's been tweeted 392 times. Right? That must have great social import to be tweeted so many times. Hundreds of people found that socially relevant. Well, if we look at the title, penile fracture seems more likely during sex under stressful situations. Now, I have no doubt that is a terrible, painful thing. But I would guess it was not tweeted because it was a really important, fundamental change to sex research. It was tweeted because it was funny. Right? That's why it was tweeted. Now, you can have erroneous citations, but 392 humorous citations are probably unlikely. So this calls to question what's actually being measured when it's tweeted. Visible? Yes. Important? Maybe not. Here's another study that we have. Now, this one was tweeted 4,454 times. Right? 4,454 people thought that this was important. Well, that seems pretty important. So we have a title, Can Apparent Superluminal Neutrino Speeds Be Explained as Quantum Weak Measurement? Then if you look down to the abstract, probably not. Right? Again, here are some of the tweets. Best abstract ever, right? No engagement with the content, with the topic, with what was happening, but rather to say, that's hilarious. Again, the humor value of this. Now, some might argue that by getting people engaged in science, even if it's humorous, is a step, right? That's a step towards science communication. And that may be so, but we need to be able to pull apart humor from scientific impact from science communication. And here's the last one I'll show you. It's an article that was printed, including the phrase, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here, right? And this one was tweeted, I think it was more than 6,000 times. And of course, you can guess what the tweets were about, not the content of it, but the fact that this got through the publishing cycle with that in it. So we have to think about what's being tweeted, but we also have to think about who's tweeting it, right? Is the initiator first a person or an organization? And does that matter? Does it matter if Nature News tweets something rather than Cassidy Sugimoto? Does it show a different impact on society? So we've done a lot of studies to look at these, and organizations make up a huge proportion of the tweets about science. Now, if we go into the next category, we have to see, are these actual people, even organizations, but a person behind that handle, or are they bots? And again, a significant amount of tweets about science are done by bots, right? Systems that search for keywords and topics and retweet things. So if half of your tweets come from a bot, did you have social impact? I would question that, right? So how do we do that? Well, We look through the tweets themselves and we look for levels of engagement. So for example, low engagement would just be retweeting the title over and over again. High degrees of engagement would be saying something about the content, even if it's just to say, this is our paper, or my friend's paper, or I've actually thought, and I'm a human, and I have read this paper, right? But this takes manual analysis, and manual analysis is very slow, it's very time-consuming. Again, we have to ask, can we create control mechanisms that can identify, are you a human or an organization, are you a bot, and what is your level of engagement with this article? So I began by saying that Altmetrics has failed, but I want to leave on a more positive note about what the future of social media metrics might look like and what challenges and opportunities we have ahead. So openness is the word du jour, right? It's open education, open data, open science, everything is open, and openness is beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. It allows access, right? And I deeply believe in access, and I think we need to promote it. Yet openness itself doesn't solve all the problems. And one of the problems it creates is a sort of feral world, right? A where the wild things are kind of world where everything is out there and everything is game, where 4,000 tweets means as much as 4,000 citations. And we need to think about standards and mechanisms, control mechanisms that capture and enhance this requisite variety. One of the ways that we have done this is to look at standards itself. So NISO received money from the Sloan Foundation to create standards for Altmetrics. ORCID, as we know, has looked at standardizing, identifying who that human is, who that producer is as a single unit. Spark has done work in open access. We have to think about what our role may be in creating these control mechanisms and these standards as well. At the end, I would love to end up here. I would love to know, to have all of these heterogeneous kinds of data come together. Now, of course, the people in this room are probably thinking about competition, right? Who shares data? What are the incentives for sharing data? And that's certainly a concern, but one that I think will actually enhance what we can do, enhance the products and the services and the tools that we can provide. Now, we also have to be aware in this that access and connection don't always solve all of our problems. In many ways, providing access can enhance the disparities that already exist. So I'll end with this quote, which is one of my favorite quotes as a science musician, is Campbell's law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it's intended to monitor. As we try to measure the value of scholars and scholarships, we have to ensure that we're not producing goal displacement, that we're having people tweeting for the sake of tweeting, rather than engaging in active science communication, engaging in active scholarship and communication with the public. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Cassidy. Are there any questions? No, I have a question, which is a bit related to where I come from. Journals in the arts and the humanities have never really gotten off to impact factors, partly because of the monographs are being considered much more important than articles. At least in the past, that is changing, but also because most of the articles cite books rather than other articles. So I was kind of hoping that new metrics would solve that problem. Can you comment on that?
Yes, is this on? That's a great question. Now, one of the things that I think is exciting is within arts and humanities. So some of these novel metrics have said, let's look at things like Goodreads. Can we collect data from that on how people are reading and engaging with monographs? Monographs have been a largely underserved genre in terms of metrics. And so many of these social media metrics are actually in making visible the impact of these monographs, which has been previously invisible. So I think that that's an exciting new movement. There's also the issue of people creating their communities online. So digital humanities is a fantastic example of that. I heard someone say at a conference the other day that if you're not on Twitter, you're not a digital humanist, right? Their community, their engagement, their dissemination of their material is largely done through Twitter. So I don't think arts and humanities are left out of this story. If anything, they're actually being brought into the story in ways that they never were with journal impact factors and citations.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have a question here.
Yeah, Dave Martinson from ACS. I have two questions, sort of unrelated. The first one is just about a chart that you threw up there. I think it was on interdisciplinarity. And I'm not sure I understand the significance of the chart, but the one thing that captured my attention was the chemistry went down to 0 at some point. So I wonder if you could explain a little more what that was about.
Sure. Sorry, I should have given more details on that. A lot of these charts come from bigger research projects, so it's hard to pull that out. So what that was is from a study of dissertations in the field of library and information science. And what we were looking at is how certain fields have come in and out of library and information science by looking at those people who serve on dissertations within that field. And so what we're seeing here is in the, for chemistry, right, in 1960s, and we had this rise through the 70s and 80s of chemistry PhDs then serving on LIS dissertations, showing this interaction between those two fields, which has largely dropped off. And so we're no longer seeing an interaction. So that is not the decline of chemistry at all. That's the decline of chemistry in that field. And what we're seeing instead is a rise in computer science and engineering coming in and shaping that field. So in some ways, what this shows us is what that field is now about. So for hyper interdisciplinary areas, we can see what the flavors of that are by the people who are moving in, right? The permeability of the boundaries for people moving in and out of a discipline.
Okay, thanks for that reassurance. The other question was about your looking at the tweets and social media in general and looking at, is this human, is it a bot? And I wondered if there's a trend in tweets or in blogs or whatever, comments within articles as becoming more associated with an identifiable person versus anonymity. And I mean, sometimes you can make comments while hiding behind the cloak of anonymity. And are we seeing changes there?
Yes. So two things I will say, and I should have noted this before, the Truthy project at Indiana University, which has come under incredible scrutiny from many people in Washington, D.C., is one example of people who have automated trying to identify bots. And so there is some work in automating bots, so I just wanted to put that there. But yes, social media research has found that people are less inclined to be anonymous than they were before. So at the start of the internet, there was this cloak of invisibility. Now people are actually creating their reputation online. So not only are they not hiding, they are enhancing, promoting themselves through these things. Now, I can see in one of these nice gears that we have for the next talk is reputation management, and I think social media falls into that to a great degree.
Hi. My name is Eric Swenson. I'm from Scopus. My first point is a point. I fundamentally disagree with the statement that altmetrics have failed, past tense. So a correlative question is, what do you feel an acceptable time frame is to make a final judgment? But before you answer that, I also want to mention that I agree that the nomenclature needs to be updated. You yourself consistently use the term altmetrics. We prefer to begin to dilute that phrase, alternative metrics, plural, and then looking at other subdisciplines that go across other axes ranging from mainstream news to alternative news mentions. I personally get really tired of alternative metrics consistently being linked to tweets and Facebook mentions and blogs. I think that that's way too narrow. So I do agree with you on that point. But back to your question, I mean, what's the real measurement for making a determination of whether or not this has failed or not? It's an early burgeoning concept.
That's a great question, right? In a lot of ways, it's a rhetorical provocation that it's failed. I think it is too narrow, and it is a misnomer. And I think for those two reasons, we should retire the word, but not retire the ideology or the sentiment, right? The sentiment that we should measure a greater variety of things, I think, is absolutely fundamental to scholarship right now. Does the term altmetrics lead us in that direction? I don't think it does. I think it prepares an argument on opposition, and I think it looks at things as alternative to, rather than capturing what has already been there. Now, there have been a lot of people who've essentially done altmetrics way before 2000, right?
Yeah.
And what I want to do is find a term, find a way to get the community around thinking about all of those things, whether it's assessing monographs or looking at tweets. And so I agree with you fundamentally that it may be perhaps too early to say it's failed, but I offer that provocation to say let's collectively think about measuring broader impact, but not using that term.
I'll agree with the provocation. I mean, for those of us who were around in the 90s and remember the totally ubiquitous and meaningless label of alternative music. Today's classic rock stations now play that as quite mainstream, so I think I hear where you're going. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gunther Eisenbach. I'm a publisher at JMIR Publications, but also editor and researcher. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. And we've been doing very early work in Altmetrics, collecting tweets like way before Altmetrics, even the term Altmetrics appeared. And well, first of all, I agree with the sentiment that Altmetrics is not a proper term because it suggests that it's an alternative metric where it's really a complementary metric to what's already out there, for example, citation metrics. But I disagree with the notion that the entire movement has failed. I mean, I can certainly testify from my perspective as an editor that I do look at these metrics, and I think some of the pitfalls of the data you showed, for example, kind of the global correlation between tweets and citations across all articles in the literature. Of course, you won't see a correlation here because you have to adjust for two important things. One is the time since publication, which is why in my paper, which I published in 2011 about the correlation between tweets and citations in my journal, I adjusted for time since publication by only looking at the tweets within the first week after publication. So that's the first pitfall in your analysis. The second is you didn't stratify by journal, and the journal is a very important confounder. And I would argue that if you look within a journal and dichotomize articles which have a high visibility and high uptake in social media, and then dichotomize the articles which are highly cited, which is exactly what I did in my paper, then it's going to be useful. There is not a linear relationship between, for example, tweets and citations. But if you look at your top 25% articles within your journal and look at the social media uptake, you will see some interesting signals here. So I'm just wondering if to your knowledge, somebody has done this, not just stratifying by discipline, but by journal. By journal,
yes. So this is a great conversation, and I won't go too much into all of the methods behind this, but suffice it to say, you mentioned that it's complementary, and I think that that's a really important thing. And actually, I believe that the low correlation coefficients support that it is complementary, that there is so much unexplained, showing that Twitter is bringing something different than citations, right? And so I think we can agree on that. And absolutely. And we did cut by journals in different analyses, so we have looked through that, and it's fundamentally different if you're looking at different journals, if you're looking at different disciplines, if you're looking at your most cited things compared to those that receive 0 citations. And so you're absolutely right in all of those things, right, that it does vary. And I think, again, that speaks to that variety. There's a huge variety. Science itself is not monolithic. All publications are not the same. Therefore, taking a global thing, saying citations and Twitter are correlated at X, is fundamentally suppressing a lot of very, very important information. So I would agree with you wholeheartedly on that. But I think that only further emphasizes that we need better metrics, we need better ways of slicing it. We need tools and platforms that allow us to do those kinds of detailed analyses and not keep these sort of superficial, single, raw, one correlation coefficient to describe what is really a heterogeneous data set.
Hello, I have a question. Ove Kehler from Brill. Of course, you described the whole situation from a sort of validation perspective, and it's really a fascinating talk. Thank you for that. We, as publishers, are interested in it from a metrics perspective to see how our journals are doing, how our articles are doing that we are publishing, to understand research trends. But how are the researchers looking at Altmetrics? Are they aware of it at all? Mm-hmm. Does it matter to them? Are they supporting it? Mm-hmm. And if they don't, I mean, that is also probably an indication whether Altmetrics are successful. If everybody's really looking at their scores, then it would be a success, even if you disagree that the metrics don't work. So has there
Yes.
been any
So-
research on how
Yeah,
this
so
is
this
picking
is
up?
this is a great point. And right now, of course, many of the studies of this are exploratory. But to your point, we do see more institutions asking people to include this in their tenure and promotion portfolios, right? Now, I should say academics are aware of it, but that doesn't mean they all love it. Academics use it, but that doesn't mean they all think it's a good tool, right? But if everyone else starts to put in their tweet counts, then you need to do it too. You need to show your value in that way. What I'm concerned about is that actually leads to a lot of goal displacement. People who are engaging and spending so much time curating their online portfolio and less time doing science.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Susan Spilka from Chorus. I really have enjoyed this talk. One thing that, as a communications professional, that I wonder about is how altmetrics and metrics in general measure the sort of softer, fuzzier measures of success, knowledge transfer, sentiment. The tools that I've seen so far haven't really come close to being able to do that. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
I think that that's the dream, right? That's the hope, is that we'd be able to do this. But the sentiment tools right now are very crude. So
Yeah.
one of my favorites, Mike Thelwell, who I mentioned earlier, was hired during the Olympics to put a sentiment analysis of Twitter on the London Eye. And so if the UK was happy, there'd be a nice smiley face, and if the UK got sad, there'd be a frowny face, right? But his metric really just looked at happy is +2, right? Sad is -1, hate is -2. Those don't capture the sentiments for scientific output. We can't even write algorithms to identify what's a tweet about science and a tweet not about science. So understanding if it's a happy tweet about science or a sad one, we're still a very long way off from that.
And sarcasm.
Sarcasm
Just throws it.
kills any sentiment analysis, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark.
Mark Celia, publishing lawyer for Elsevier. So as a publishing lawyer, I often get involved with questions about publishing ethics and plagiarism. So I was very interested in the comments you made about fraud, because sadly, the internet and even science publishing is full of such things, unfortunately. So it sounded like I didn't hear clear sort of discussions about possible tools for that. It sounds like at some point it's some type of human curation and somebody actually looking at things and saying, well, this is parody, or this is satire, or this is irrelevant. Do you have ideas about sort of tools to sort of capture that human curation about those points?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question. Now, I think we're actually further along on plagiarism tools than we are on sentiment tools, right? There are many good ways to capture precise plagiarism or plagiarism within one or two. So text mining tools allow us to do that. But still, when we're looking within 140 characters and slight manipulations, this becomes harder as well. So I'd say that, yes, in terms of blogs and identifying those, we're good at text analysis in terms of plagiarism, but we're bad at seeing that when it's modified slightly, right, when we have those kinds of modifications. So I think that we have a ways to go on that as well.
But so we use cross-check quite a bit for plagiarism, and our editors are doing that. But even there, at some point, the editor has to actually look at the analysis and make a determination, because some copying of some text in a methods section, for example, doesn't actually matter that much. So human curation is still there.
Human creation is there, though. Well, and, Turnitin or other things give you a percentage score. So what does 60% mean? At what point does something become plagiarism? And at what point is something flagrant self-plagiarism, right? If you use the same method in your lab all the time and your methods are identical, is that self-plagiarism, and is that bad, right? So I think we still have a lot of qualitative judgments that go into all of these.
I'm Tad Campion, New England Journal of Medicine. Very interesting discussion, and all the problems and weaknesses of the metrics, the social media metrics, altmetrics with a small a, are true, are accurate. But the interesting thing, I think, is that despite all the failures, that there's a tremendous demand desperate demand for some kind of measures. The demand, especially from funders, promotion committees, the Congress, when you're trying to answer the question, what did that research lead to? And the expectation isn't really so realistic that you're going to show that it altered the course of science or the previous paper led to improvement in human disease. And citations take time. Not everything can win in the citation game. There's a great demand for some kind of measures of effect, impact, relevance, even just having been read. What direction do you see things going, given that there's still this desperate need for other measures?
I think it's exciting, right? I think it's a breaking down of the ivory tower. I think it's allowing for greater dialogue and engagement with the public. Unfortunately, these measures don't seem to capture that. So one of the things we've done is we've taken tweets and we've looked at who tweets about science, hoping, it's, I think someone said yesterday, Maple from Virginia or something, right? So your average person, are they doing this? And it's not, right? The people tweeting about science are other astronomers, the kinds of people who would read and cite your work anyway. I agree that there is a desperate need, and some of this is one that I ideologically agree with. Some of it is for accountability because people don't believe in the value of public higher education anymore, so we have to sort of disentangle those two things. Do we need metrics that capture that? Absolutely. Do these metrics capture it? I'm not convinced.
Richard?
Richard Getty from STM. Following on from what you were saying about most tweets on astrophysics being by astrophysicists, one wonders out loud whether that's true right across the academic spectrum, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, where maybe the literature is a little bit more accessible to the private, non-academic individual. And I'm wondering whether you think there would be scope or any value in attempting to harness the power of ORCID and H indices and such like in such a way that one could automatically get some idea of not only who, but how prestigious already were the tweeters of information about your work.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So I should mention that tools such as altmetric.com are trying to do this, try to understand who those tweeters are, and they'll tell you that it was the public or not the public. What we've found in those analyses is it's pretty inaccurate, right? So our metrics aren't good for doing that yet. And in terms of indices that have come out of this, my favorite has to be the Kardashian index, and those are for scholars who tweet at a way higher proportion than they're publishing. Right? So their content is actually pretty low, but their visibility is pretty high. We need better metrics for this to say, if you're being retweeted by Stephen Hawking, that should mean something, right? So I agree, but we're really bad at it right now.
Looks like that there's some difficulty right now in finding good metrics for either papers or authors. But if you think about it, papers is just content. I know people don't like saying that word, but that's what it is. So what industries that deal with content have been able to find new metric systems that they've been able to quickly apply to a ranking of their media? Do you know a company or an area out there that have been able to apply it well, that we could take those lessons and apply it to our industry?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I have to say, when we're thinking about content delivery, and you think back to Priam's thing that it's messy and fast-moving, right? So many companies right now are dealing with the ephemerality of content, right? So a BuzzFeed model of this, right? Give people content fast, right? They absorb the content and they move on. They don't care about the presentation, the quality, the history. Permanence is not important. Standards are not important. It's getting content out to people. Now, we could say, great, that's how science should go. It should be a BuzzFeed model. Here's science, and you're always on, and you're going to be active or passive users receiving that. I think science is a fundamentally different kind of content, right? Science is cumulative. Science needs to have permanence, needs to have records, right? It needs a different thing. I'm concerned that if we take the current models of content delivery, we lose something fundamental about science. And so that concerns me, that the only models I could think of and point to are not ones I'd like to see for science.
Well, thank you for that.
Darryl?
Yes.
In the information science world, have a number of the scholars, such as yourself, decided to do what they're doing in the health side with clinical translation, where you partner together to try to solve some of these very intense statistical algorithmic problems? Do you guys collaborate across universities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I love my field because it is so collaborative and it's so interdisciplinary. So there are a lot of people from physics who come in with complex networks and they can help us understand Twitter. We have linguists who come in to help us understand the text. The partnership that I'd like to see is actually from all of those different academics to the corporate world, to publishers. I think that that's what we're missing in here. I told Efka how much I loved coming to the London seminar and being one of 3 academics in the room who works and publishes in this area. It was really enlightening to me. It was a conversation and perspective that I don't hear at my conferences. And so I think that that's where the opportunity is right now. We've already figured out how to collaborate across fields. What we haven't figured out how to do is collaborate across sectors.
I also have a question. I was wondering, is there the possibility that we move from wider variety to more convergence again? And I say this with a focus group in mind that we held with young researchers, and they tweet a lot. We wanted to know from them which social networks they use. And they're incredibly active on Twitter to follow others, but also to push their own research and results, etc., etc. So my expectation was that they would also want to use alternative metrics a lot, but at least that group was not very impressed by alternative metrics, and actually they really refer to the old citation scores. That is really their measure. And I was wondering, in that perspective, there's more to measure, there are more measurements, there are more manifestations on the web, so there's also the danger that people game it, that we don't see the forest from the trees anymore. But how do you see the possibilities to come back to convergence and maybe some very simple quality measure that says it all?
I would love to see that quality measure. I love that the title of this section is the disruption and eruption, right? And in many ways, we can think about us being in a time of chaos and sort of paradigm setting in a Kuhnian sense of it, is that there are lots of alternatives right now, and we're trying to explore all of those and see what works, right? And so I do think that at some point we might have convergence, but what we've seen in the last 5 years is not convergence, but displacement and constant displacement, right? I mean, I'm sure none of the people on your early career panel are on MySpace anymore, right? But do a career panel 5 years ago, and maybe some still would be. Very few people are using Facebook anymore, but 5 years ago everyone was. So it tends not to be convergence on one, but displacement and replacement and constant replacement. So what we have to figure out to do, is there an underlying value, right, that people are following along in all of these things? Can we converge on that value? I don't think we'll converge on a platform.
David.
Another question, kind of following up on the previous one about what you would take from other domains and apply in the sciences. And I wondered, given your deep study of the alternative metrics and what you've learned about that, and also in terms of gender bias, what has that led you to adopt personally for managing your own reputation? Do you try to do that? Do you avoid it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm a late adopter on most things. And I was a late adopter to Twitter because I thought it was just, a navel-gazing waste of time. But my doctoral students really convinced me. So I have had several doctoral students now who, from their first day, they were blogging, they were tweeting, and they were getting fantastic invitations to collaborate on some really interesting projects because they were visible, because they were out there. And I realized that I could do that too, right? And so I do spend more time on Twitter, on all these other social media metrics, on ResearchGate, among others. And it has had a payoff in terms of meeting people who are doing the kind of research that I'm doing, having conversations with them. I think it's enhanced my scholarship. So as a means to an end, I think it's achieved that end, but it does take energy, right? And that energy, our energy is somewhat finite, right? And so if we're directing our energy into our reputation management, then that's time that we're displacing from teaching. That's time we're displacing from research. That's time we're displacing from service to our profession. So I'm concerned about it, but I'm engaged in it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Is there any question? No? Then let's give Cassidy a large hand. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Cassidy. Thank you, Sam. This was a wonderful session. Thank you for all the questions you had.